Some workplaces are dangerous by their very nature. Everyone who walks through the gate understands, at some level, that the job carries risk. But there's a difference between risk and recklessness, between a hazard that couldn't be predicted and a catastrophe that was entirely preventable. The disasters on this list didn't happen because fate was cruel. They happened because warnings were ignored, corners were cut, and workers paid the price with their lives. Here are the 5 most disturbing workplace deaths of all time. It was the morning of October 10, 2024. The early shift had just begun at Accurate Energetic Systems, a military munitions plant sprawled across 1,300 acres of wooded Tennessee countryside near Bucksnort, about 60 miles southwest of Nashville. The facility made explosives and demolition charges for the United States Army. On that Friday morning, 16 workers were inside one of the hilltop production buildings when something went catastrophically wrong. At approximately 7:45 in the morning, a massive explosion tore through the building and obliterated it completely. The blast registered 1.6 on the Richter scale and woke people from their sleep more than 20 miles away. One resident said he thought the house had collapsed around him. Another, living more than 20 miles from the plant, heard it and assumed lightning had struck his roof. Charred debris and twisted vehicles were scattered across an area of at least half a square mile. Fragments of the building were found more than 2 miles from the site. Emergency crews couldn't get close. Secondary explosions continued to detonate throughout the day, forcing rescuers back each time they tried to advance. Investigators from the ATF's National Response Team arrived and began working foot by foot from the outer edges of the scene inward, documenting every piece of evidence as they moved toward the origin point. Officials used cell phone tower records to try to confirm who had been inside at the moment of the blast. DNA was needed to identify what remained of the victims. There were no survivors. All 16 workers on shift that morning were gone. The names released in the days that followed painted a picture of a community that had lost its own. Jason Adams, 52, had worked at the plant for 30 years and had just celebrated his 26th wedding anniversary. Donald Yowell, 58, a chemist, had also given the facility 3 decades of his working life. Jeremy Moore, 37, a father described as a kind and caring man, had been with the company for 17 years. Billy Baker, 59, a department manager, had been there since 2006. At the other end of the experience range, Rachel Woodall, 28, had started just over a month before the explosion. Adam Boatman, 21, one of the youngest on site that morning, left behind a twin brother. Trenton Stewart, 25, was weeks away from his wedding. He pastored a small non-denominational church in Waverly and served as a firefighter with the city's Department of Public Safety. What made the loss so heavy was how ordinary the morning had been. These were neighbors, parents, people whose company baseball caps were a familiar sight at local events. The Humphreys County Sheriff, who knew 3 of the victims personally, stood at a news conference and struggled to finish his sentences. "This could be people that you grew up with," he said. "We love each other." But the plant's record told a darker story. In 2019, state inspectors cited serious hazards after several employees suffered seizures from exposure to cyclonite, a powerful explosive compound linked to nervous system damage. Residue was found on work tables and in the break room where people ate their lunches. The company contested the findings. The fines were reduced to $7,200. 1 year later, a former maintenance supervisor said he had stopped a fire in the same production building using a garden hose and was subsequently fired for violating company policy. The unsafe conditions he had reported went unaddressed. The 16 fatalities at Accurate Energetic Systems represented the largest single-event workplace death toll in the United States since 29 coal miners were killed at Upper Big Branch in 2010. The cause of the October 2024 explosion remained under investigation at the time authorities completed their initial review of the scene. What was not under investigation was the pattern that preceded it. The warnings had existed. The inspectors had visited. The fines had been small, contested, and reduced. The corrections had never come. The building that held those 16 people on a Friday morning in rural Tennessee had been telling that story for years. Nobody with the power to act had listened closely enough. Imperial Sugar Refinery, Port Wentworth, Georgia, 2008. On February 7, 2008, at 7 in the evening, the Imperial Sugar Refinery in Port Wentworth, Georgia, was running a normal shift. The facility sat on the bank of the Savannah River, a 4-story structure built in 1916, its machinery aging, its construction methods decades out of date. Sugar moved through the building on conveyor belts and elevators, feeding the packaging area from massive concrete silos that stood 100 feet tall. There were 112 workers on site that night. Then the basement beneath the silos became a furnace. The explosion began in a storage area where refined sugar was held before packaging. Sugar dust, fine as talcum powder and highly combustible, had accumulated in thick layers throughout the building over years of inadequate housekeeping. The initial blast sent shockwaves through the structure, throwing that settled dust into the air. What followed was a chain of secondary explosions that tore through the plant, floor by floor, chasing workers through hallways and stairwells as the building came apart around them. Witnesses across the Savannah River in South Carolina watched flames shoot several stories into the sky. Ambulances came from 12 counties, firefighters from 3. The Coast Guard closed the river. A helicopter searched the water for anyone the blast had thrown in. A Red Cross worker who arrived among the first described it as walking into hell. Some of the men she reached had no skin at all. Others had skin that was simply dripping from them. Patients arrived at nearby hospitals with burns covering 80 to 90% of their bodies. One had burns over 95%. 6 workers were still missing at the end of that first night. They were found the following morning, 3 of them in underground tunnels that ran beneath the plant, where they had been trapped in total darkness. There was no emergency lighting anywhere in the building. 40 workers later told investigators they had never received any training on how to exit in an emergency. Only 5 employees could remember ever participating in a fire drill. 14 people were dead in total. 5 of them had made it out of the plant that night, but lost their lives in the weeks that followed at a burn center in Augusta. The U.S. Chemical Safety Board spent more than a year investigating, and its conclusion was direct. The explosion had been entirely preventable. The sugar industry had understood that sugar dust was combustible since at least 1926. Imperial Sugar's own internal memos from 1967 had flagged the specific danger of dust explosions at the Port Wentworth facility. Those memos had been written, filed, and forgotten. In the years before the explosion, construction changes made at the plant had actually made it easier for sugar dust to accumulate in enclosed spaces. Nothing had been done to reverse that. OSHA cited Imperial Sugar for 211 safety violations across the Port Wentworth plant and its facility in Louisiana. The agency found the company had acted with plain indifference to employee safety. The initial proposed fine was $8.8 million. After settlement negotiations, Imperial paid $6 million and admitted no fault. No criminal charges were ever filed. A federal prosecutor concluded there wasn't sufficient evidence of intentional disregard to bring a case and noted the absence of federal criminal laws specifically targeting safety failures in the sugar industry. The company had held internal documents warning of this exact danger for more than 40 years. Its workers had never been drilled on how to leave a burning building. The tunnels beneath the plant had no lights. And the legal outcome was a negotiated payment the company absorbed without admitting it had done anything wrong. The factory had been the main employer in a town of 3,500 people, and Port Wentworth's economy contracted in the years after it ceased operating. 44 civil lawsuits were filed by victims and their families. The last person to leave a hospital burn unit was a worker named Lawrence Manker Jr., who had undergone 70 surgeries for burns, covering 85% of his body. He settled his lawsuit in 2011, more than 3 years after the night the building became an inferno. Upper Big Branch Mine, Mont Cole, West Virginia, 2010, April 5, 2010. A Monday afternoon just after 3 o'clock, roughly 1,000 feet underground in Raleigh County, West Virginia. The miners working the Upper Big Branch South Mine were deep into their shift when the mountain turned against them, A methane ignition near the longwall tailgate, where coal and sandstone were being cut, triggered a small explosion. That small explosion hit walls, floor, and ceiling, thick with accumulated coal dust. In underground mining, coal dust is the accelerant that transforms a containable event into something unsurvivable. Within seconds, the fire had become a coal dust explosion that roared through the tunnels, killing miners as far as 5,000 feet from the point of ignition. 29 men were gone. 2 others survived with injuries. Rail lines were twisted like pretzels. Mining machines were blown to pieces. One survivor described a rush of air, then hurricane-force winds, then flying debris as he ran. A miner working at a separate site 7 miles away said it felt like being inside a tornado. The blast was the worst coal mining disaster the United States had seen in 40 years. Rescue teams mobilized from across the region, more than 20 teams in total. They were forced to evacuate 3 times as methane and carbon monoxide built to dangerous concentrations inside the tunnels. Crews drilled shafts into the mine from the surface to release the gases. 4 miners remained missing after the first day. Their bodies were found on April 9th. None of them had reached either of the 2 safety chambers the mine had been equipped with. The investigation that followed was one of the most thorough in American mining history, and what it uncovered was a picture of deliberate concealment. The company operating the mine, Massey Energy's Performance Coal subsidiary, had accumulated 1,142 safety citations at Upper Big Branch in the 5 years before the explosion. 57 citations had been issued in the single month before the blast. Investigators found that Massey kept 2 sets of books. The official examination records, open to federal inspectors, were incomplete. A parallel set of internal documents recorded hazards that never made it into the required books, hazards that inspectors were never shown. When federal inspectors arrived at the mine, surface personnel radioed underground to warn workers so that violations could be hidden before inspectors reached the working sections. Massey's chief of security was later convicted in federal court for lying to investigators about this practice. He had personally directed security guards to provide advance notice, despite company policy that prohibited it. Miners had been told directly that raising safety concerns would cost them their jobs. Not one safety or health complaint had been filed with the Mine Safety and Health Administration from any underground worker at Upper Big Branch in the 4 years before the explosion. The mine had experienced methane events in 1997, 2003, and 2004. Each time, management recorded it as an isolated incident and moved on without addressing the underlying conditions. The physical causes were specific. The longwall shearer, the machine cutting coal from the rock face, had been running with worn cutting bits and 7 missing water spray nozzles. Those nozzles existed to suppress methane and cool the heat that metal-on-rock friction generated. Without them, the methane ignited. The mine had also not been properly rock dusted, the basic practice of coating tunnel surfaces with inert material to stop coal dust from becoming fuel. The ventilation system had not been maintained according to its approved plan. Every one of these failures had been documented somewhere in the company's own records. Not one had been corrected. Massey's chief executive, Don Blankenship, was indicted in 2014. He was convicted in 2015 of a misdemeanor conspiracy charge and served 1 year in federal prison. The company that acquired Massey's assets paid $209 million in a Department of Justice settlement, the largest penalty of its kind in the history of American mining. The memorial in Whitesville, West Virginia, carries all 29 names in black granite. One investigative report described the company as a towering presence in the Appalachian coalfields that operated its mines in a profoundly reckless manner. 29 coal miners paid for that with their lives. At approximately 4:40 in the afternoon on March the 25th, 1911, a fire broke out on the 8th floor of the Ash Building in Greenwich Village, New York City. The Triangle Shirtwaist factory occupied the top 3 floors of the 10-story structure. Inside, hundreds of workers, most of them young immigrant women, sat at long rows of sewing machines producing women's blouses. The workday was nearly over. Within minutes, the fire spread through bolts of fabric, scraps of cloth, and tissue paper patterns that covered the floors. Workers on the 8th floor managed to get out, either down stairwells or by reaching those on the 10th floor by telephone. The 9th floor had no warning at all. The women on the 9th floor found the stairwell doors locked. The owners of the factory, Isaac Harris and Max Blank, had ordered the doors kept locked during working hours to prevent theft and to stop workers from taking unauthorized breaks. There was a single fire escape on the outside of the building, narrow and poorly constructed. It buckled under the weight of those trying to use it and pulled away from the wall. The elevators made a handful of trips before the heat made them impossible to operate. Workers crowded to the windows. Those on the street below watched as young women began to jump. Some held hands as they fell. The sound of impact when they hit the pavement was audible from across the street. Firefighters arrived to find their ladders reached only as high as the 6th floor. The nets they spread on the ground below couldn't hold the weight of people falling from the 9th. In less than 20 minutes, 146 workers were dead. The youngest was 14 years old. The aftermath moved the city in ways few disasters had before or since. A public viewing of the unclaimed dead drew 100,000 people. A march through the streets of New York brought out 400,000 more. Harris and Blanc were indicted on manslaughter charges. They went to trial in December 1911 and were acquitted. Their attorney had successfully argued that the prosecution couldn't prove the owners knew the doors were locked at the specific moment the fire began. 2 years after that, a civil suit produced a settlement of $75 per victim's family. $75. What followed in the years after the fire, though, reshaped American labor law in ways that outlasted everyone in that courtroom. A factory investigating commission in New York pushed through 36 new pieces of legislation covering fire safety, building standards, working hours, and labor protections for women and children. Frances Perkins, who had been standing on the street that afternoon and watched workers fall, went on to become Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor. She spent the rest of her career describing March 25, 1911, as the day that made the human cost of inaction impossible to look away from. The building had no sprinkler system. No fire drills had ever been conducted inside it. The fire escape, the one safety feature visible from the street, was so poorly built that it gave way almost immediately. And the owners had locked the doors not because of any technical failure or oversight, but because they didn't trust the people they employed to stay at their machines without being physically contained. That decision, made to protect cloth and thread and the time it took to produce them, killed 146 people in under 20 minutes. Harris and Blanc kept running garment factories after their acquittal. Within 2 years of the Triangle Fire, inspectors cited them for a locked door violation at their new location. The fine issued was $20, not $20 per victim, not $20 per locked door, $20 total for the same practice that had already filled the streets of New York with grief. The owners paid it and went back to work. Phillips Petroleum Chemical Complex, Pasadena, Texas, 1989, October 23, 1989. Just after 1 in the afternoon at the Phillips Petroleum Company's Houston Chemical Complex in Pasadena, Texas, near the Houston Ship Channel. The facility produced roughly 1.5 billion pounds of high-density polyethylene each year, the plastic used in milk bottles and food containers. About 1,500 people worked there, including hundreds of contract workers brought in for maintenance. That Monday, a crew from a subcontractor called Fish Engineering was servicing one of the plant's polyethylene reactors. The procedure required isolation valves to be closed and the air hoses that operated them physically disconnected. But the air connections for opening and closing one critical valve were identical, and they had been reconnected the wrong way around. The valve the control room believed was closed was actually open. When the switch was thrown, more than 85,000 pounds of highly flammable ethylene and isobutane gas poured out of the reactor almost instantaneously. There were no gas detectors. There were no warning systems of any kind. The vapor cloud spread through the plant, and within 90 to 120 seconds it found an ignition source. The explosion registered 3.5 on the Richter scale. The fireball was visible 15 miles away. Debris was thrown as far as 6 miles from the plant. 23 workers were killed. 314 others were injured. The 2 polyethylene production buildings nearest the blast were gone. In the administration building nearly half a mile away, windows shattered and bricks tore free from the walls. Firefighting collapsed almost immediately. The blast had sheared fire hydrants off at ground level. The shutoff valves that could have isolated the burning lines were buried in wreckage. Of the 3 backup diesel pumps, one was already out of service before the explosion began, and a second ran out of fuel within an hour. Water had to be drawn from a cooling tower, a neighboring plant, and the ship channel itself. The fire burned for 10 hours. Fish Engineering had caused a nearly identical incident at the same plant just 2 months earlier, in August 1989. A fish employee had opened gas piping without isolating the line, releasing flammable material that ignited and killed 1 worker. Fish remained on the job. The last comprehensive OSHA inspection of the Phillips facility had been conducted in 1975, 14 years before the explosion. OSHA proposed fines of $5.6 million against Phillips. After negotiations, the company paid $4 million and admitted nothing. No criminal charges were filed. In 1992, the disaster helped push OSHA to issue its Process Safety Management Standard, one of the most consequential workplace safety rules in American history. It came 3 years too late for the 23 people who drove to work in Pasadena on an ordinary Monday and never drove home. A granite memorial near the site was dedicated on the first anniversary. It remains open to the public. These 5 disasters span more than a century and thousands of miles. Sugar dust in Georgia, coal dust in West Virginia, explosive residue on a break room table in Tennessee, flammable gas in Texas, locked doors in New York. The materials were different. The industries were different. But the pattern beneath each one was the same. The warnings existed before the bodies were counted. The hazards had been written down, inspected, fined, and in some cases actively concealed. What failed in each case was not the ability to see the danger. It was the decision, repeated across years and management meetings and budget reviews, not to act on it. The workers who walked into those buildings on those mornings had no reason to believe the day would end differently from any other. They trusted that someone, somewhere in the chain above them, had made sure it was safe enough to walk through the door.